Welcome to another new video. This is a story that will force you to reconsider everything you believe about justice, survival, and just how far a person will go to seize their own freedom. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you never miss tales like this one. The scene was 1847, nestled deep within Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The morning mist clung to the ancient oak trees, like spectral fingers, and somewhere within those shadows, a legend was just beginning to take shape. But legends aren't born in a single moment. They are forged in the intense heat of suffering, sculpted by years of meticulous observation, and hardened by an unbreakable will. His name was James, although the plantation ledger simply recorded him as property number 47, aged 28. His back was a canvas of scars, each one mapping a previous failed attempt at freedom. Yet his eyes held a fire, an intelligence that his masters had worked tirelessly to crush. What they couldn't chain, however, was his mind. A mind sharper than any forged steel, possessing an understanding of human nature that went far deeper than any book could teach. The Davenport estate dominated over 4,000 acres of Virginian land, its entire wealth constructed upon the forced labor of more than 300 enslaved individuals. The owner, Master Jonathan Davenport, had a reputation across 3 counties as a man of exceptional cruelty, one who was convinced that fear was the sole language his chattel could comprehend. He was mistaken about many things, but on one point, his intuition was dead accurate. James was plotting. "That boy has the devil looking out of his eyes," Davenport frequently warned his overseer, Marcus Crenshaw. "He studies people like they're books he's reading, and I don't like the knowledge he's gaining. Keep a close eye on him. He's cooking up something major." Davenport's anxiety was justified. For over 2 years, James had been formulating a plan, but it wasn't merely an escape he was designing. He was orchestrating a solitary revolution. He had scrutinized every white man on the property, absorbing their routines, their anxieties, their vulnerabilities. He knew which overseers had a weakness for drink, which sentries dozed on their watch, and even how to influence which dogs responded to particular commands. More significantly, he had deciphered the very psychology of dominance, understanding how men who had never faced genuine opposition would crumble the instant their control was challenged. James's life began on that very plantation, born to a mother who perished in childbirth and a father who remained a stranger. His grandmother, old Sarah, raised him, teaching him from a young age that true survival meant more than just drawing breath. It meant remaining unseen while your intellect flourished. "Listen more than you speak," old Sarah had whispered to him as a child. "Observe more than you act. Those white folks believe we're simple because they need us to be simple. But simple minds don't last, child. Hold on to that." She passed away when James was 15, but not before passing on a crucial skill: how to truly understand the land. Old Sarah had been born free in the North Carolina mountains before being seized and sold into the southern slave trade. She possessed knowledge of every plant, the track of every animal, and every sign the weather offered. She taught James that the wilderness wasn't an enemy to dread, it was a force to comprehend. "The forest couldn't care less about your skin color," she had told him. "It only cares if you possess the wisdom to pay attention to what it's revealing." For the next 13 years following her death, James became a devoted listener. He learned which berries provided sustenance and which brought death. He discovered the art of moving without a sound through thick brush, how to hide his scent from tracking hounds, and how to predict weather shifts days ahead by reading the sky. Yet, the most vital lesson was patience. To the other enslaved people on the plantation, James appeared quiet, compliant, and forgettable. To the overseers, He was a steady worker who never made waves. To Master Davenport, he was evidence that certain slaves could indeed be properly subdued. Every single one of them was mistaken. James was a scholar, and the plantation served as his academy. Each day was an intelligence-gathering mission. He memorized the patterns of patrols and the timing of guard shifts. He took note of which sentinels were vigilant and which were careless. He delved into the psychology of the hunting dogs, learning each one's personality and weaknesses. He even cultivated friendships with some of the impoverished white farmers in the vicinity, men who saw him as harmless and freely discussed local geography and politics within his hearing. But James's education extended far beyond simple watching. He had secretly taught himself to read using discarded newspapers and by eavesdropping on conversations within the big house. He grasped the political strains of the era, the expanding rift between North and South, and the economic engines driving the slave system. He recognized that his personal flight was merely a tiny piece of a much larger conflict, and he strategized accordingly. Throughout his years of groundwork, James also built a web of contacts among the enslaved populations of nearby plantations. Through carefully timed meetings at church services and market days, he gathered information about escape routes, safe houses, and the operations of the Underground Railroad. More critically, he learned about the men who tracked runaways, their methods, their vulnerabilities, their psychological makeup. James discovered that most slave catchers were driven by profit, not by any deep-seated belief. They were frequently poor whites who saw hunting humans as an effortless source of income. They depended on instilling fear and overwhelming their targets with numbers, rather than on genuine skill or intelligence. The vast majority had never encountered truly organized defiance, and they had certainly never been the ones being hunted. This understanding shaped James's ultimate strategy. He wouldn't just flee. He would invert the entire system of slave catching, making it work against itself. He would evolve into a predator so effective, so terrifying, that the mere thought of pursuing him would plant nightmares in men's minds. Over the years, opportunities to escape had presented themselves dozens of times. Yet James always held back. He understood that a straightforward escape would only lead to being caught again, or to death. What he was designing was something far more grand and far more perilous. He was preparing to become a living nightmare. James had also invested years in studying the local landscape with the focus of a military cartographer. He was familiar with every cave, every hidden spring, every game trail twisting through the peaks. He had pinpointed natural defensive positions and escape paths that would be undetectable to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. More significantly, he had begun hiding supplies at strategic spots throughout the mountains, food that would keep, tools that could double as weapons, even crude maps drawn on pieces of bark and sealed in waterproof containers. The mental preparation was arguably even more vital than the physical. James had dedicated countless hours to visualizing different situations, planning his reactions to various forms of pursuit. He had examined the behavior of hunted animals, learning their evasion techniques, and applied those same principles to his own predicament. He had even practiced moving silently through the woods at night, conditioning his body to find its way by touch and sound when sight was impossible. The final push came on a blistering August day in 1847. While working in the tobacco fields, James witnessed something that transformed years of careful planning into immediate urgent action. A newly purchased young woman named Mary, bought just weeks before, had fainted from heat stroke. Instead of offering water or shade, Overseer Crenshaw started lashing her with his whip, yelling that she was pretending to be weak to shirk her duties. James watched as the other enslaved people turned away, aware that any interference would only lead to their own punishment. He watched as Crenshaw's whip carved bloody furrows across Mary's back, and he watched as something within him finally reached its breaking point. That night, while the plantation slept, James made his final arrangements. He had stashed supplies in concealed spots across the mountains: food, tools, weapons he had painstakingly crafted and hidden. He had examined maps taken from the plantation house, memorizing every path, every river, every settlement for hundreds of miles in all directions. But most significantly, he had steeled himself psychologically. James understood that what he was about to do would change him forever. From a victim into a hunter, from property into an unstoppable force. There would be no turning back, no return to the relative security of enslavement. He would either perish free, or he would become something that would linger in the nightmares of every Virginia slaveholder. The chance arrived on a pitch black October night. A powerful thunderstorm had swept through the valley, drowning out sounds and erasing scents. While the other enslaved individuals huddled in their cabins, James melted into the darkness like vapor. He navigated the forest with the quiet of a predator, his bare feet finding secure holds on slick leaves and uneven rocks. Behind him, the plantation shrank until it was merely a faint gleam in the distance. Ahead stretched hundreds of miles of untamed country, and beyond that, maybe, just possibly liberty. But James had made one essential error in judgment. He had underestimated the lengths to which Jonathan Davenport would go to make an example of him. By daybreak, when Overseer Crenshaw discovered the empty quarters, Davenport was already putting together the most extensive manhunt the county had ever witnessed. 30 armed men, 2 packs of bloodhounds, and a reward that had every impoverished white farmer within 5 counties grabbing their weapons. $1,000, Davenport declared to the assembled crowd outside the county courthouse. $1,000 for the return of my property, dead or alive, plus an extra $500 for anyone who brings me proof that he suffered before his death. It represented more money than most of these men would see in a decade. The chase was on, but the pursuers had no concept of what they were truly pursuing. The initial week was an advanced lesson in psychological warfare, though the hunters were oblivious that they were the ones being instructed. James drifted through the mountains like an apparition, yet he wasn't simply fleeing. He was examining his trackers from hidden overlooks. He watched the search parties, absorbing their methods, their personalities, their vulnerabilities. He noted which men naturally took charge and which simply followed. He observed who was genuinely courageous and who was merely there for the payment. Most importantly, he identified who would crumble first when the situation reversed. The bloodhounds were tireless, their baying bouncing through the valleys like the cries of demons. But James had anticipated this as well. He had dedicated months to familiarizing himself with the scent of particular plants that could disguise his path. He knew which streams would eliminate his smell and which would spread it further. He had even learned to copy the movement patterns of local wildlife, confusing the dogs about what they were actually following. During those initial days of the chase, James employed strategies that would have impressed any military tactician. He constructed false paths that sent search parties wandering in circles for hours. He exploited the landscape to his benefit, guiding groups of hunters into box canyons and swamplands, where their horses turned into burdens instead of advantages. He even managed to turn the hunting dogs against each other by using smells and noises that provoked their territorial instincts. But perhaps most importantly, James began to dissect the psychological dynamics of the search parties. He noticed that the men were driven by different motives, some by greed, others by the excitement of the chase, and still others by a need to demonstrate their dominance over what they viewed as an inferior race. Grasping these motivations would prove essential in the mental combat ahead. On the fourth day, exhausted and surviving on sheer resolve and carefully measured provisions, James made a discovery that would alter everything. Concealed within a rocky outcropping deep in the mountains, he found the remnants of an old Cherokee settlement. Deserted decades earlier, when the tribe was pushed west on the Trail of Tears. But more importantly, he found something else, proof that he wasn't the first to use this location as a sanctuary. Etched into the stone were symbols and markings left by other fugitives, a hidden language of survival that had been transmitted through generations of the desperate and the courageous. Among those marks, James discovered detailed insights into the trackers' routines, their weaknesses, their anxieties. Previous escapees had left behind a rich collection of knowledge about how to endure in these mountains, and, more crucially, how to reverse the hunt on the hunters. The Cherokee camp also contained another item of tremendous value: weapons. Hidden in a carefully disguised stash were tomahawks, knives, and even an old musket with powder and shot. The Cherokee who had inhabited this place were warriors, and they had made preparations for a final stand. Now their tools would arm a different kind of fighter in a different kind of conflict. James spent 2 days at the camp, not merely resting and restocking, but absorbing knowledge. The Cherokee had bequeathed more than just weapons and warnings. They had passed on a warfare philosophy that would revolutionize James's approach to his circumstances. The Cherokee grasped that when confronting a more powerful enemy, victory came not through direct combat, but through endurance, cleverness, and the ability to turn the opponent's advantages into disadvantages. That was when James understood something that would metamorphose him from prey into predator. He wasn't merely being chased by men, he was being chased by men who had never genuinely been chased themselves. They understood pursuit, but they had never tasted authentic fear. They knew tracking, but they had never been tracked. They were masters of intimidation, but they had never been intimidated. James chose to provide them with an education. Among the Cherokee items, James also discovered something that would become essential: detailed knowledge of local weather cycles and seasonal shifts. The Cherokee had coexisted with these mountains for countless generations, and their accumulated wisdom about enduring harsh conditions was encoded in symbols and illustrations throughout the camp. James learned about hidden water springs that never froze, about caves that offered natural refuge from the fiercest storms, and about the migratory patterns of prey animals that could supply food when other options failed. Perhaps most crucially, James discovered that the Cherokee had confronted similar difficulties when battling against overwhelming odds. Their methods of guerrilla warfare, hit and run assaults, and psychological terror had enabled them to oppose much larger armies for years. James scrutinized these methods carefully, adjusting them to his own circumstances and adding innovations based on his distinct insight into his pursuer's mindset. The initial lesson occurred on the 7th day. Thomas Garrett was a local farmer who had joined the pursuit more for excitement than for the bounty. He was a boaster who informed anyone willing to listen about his tracking abilities and his history hunting dangerous game. He had never pursued anything more hazardous than a deer. But the other members of his search party were unaware of that. Garrett was following what he believed was James's path through a narrow ravine when the earth simply collapsed beneath him. The pit was 15 feet deep, lined with sharpened stakes that James had spent hours constructing. But James hadn't engineered the trap to kill swiftly. He had designed it to instruct. The pit was a marvel of engineering ingenuity. James had analyzed the soil composition and drainage patterns to guarantee the trap would stay intact until sprung. He had computed the depth and angle to optimize psychological impact, while making sure his target would survive long enough to comprehend what had occurred. Most significantly, he had situated the trap at a spot where Garrett's screams would reach his companions, maximizing the fear factor. Garrett's cries echoed through the peaks for hours before they eventually ceased. But it wasn't just the screams that frightened the other hunters when they discovered the pit 2 days later. It was what James had left behind. Garrett's rifle was missing, along with his ammunition and gear. His boots had been taken off and placed tuttily at the edge of the pit, as if he had simply decided to go for a swim. And etched into a close-by tree was a simple statement. Lesson 1. The hunted is now the hunter. Class is in session. But James had left more than just a statement. He had also left proof of his intellect and forethought that deeply unsettled the hunters. The pit exhibited indications of careful construction, proper drainage to avoid collapse, strategic positioning for greatest effect, even a small stash of supplies hidden nearby that implied James had been arranging this particular trap for weeks. Fear started to infiltrate the search party like a gradual toxin. These were men used to terrifying others, not being terrified themselves. They had joined the chase anticipating a quick reward, not a mental battle against an adversary who appeared to anticipate their every action before they made it. But the bounty was too substantial to disregard, and Davenport's fury was too hazardous to disappoint. The plantation owner had made it clear that any man who quit the search would be labeled a coward and would never find work in the county again. For struggling farmers barely surviving, that was nearly as much a death sentence as confronting James in the wilderness. The chase went on, but now the pursuers moved in bigger groups, their eyes continuously checking the forest, their fingers never far from their triggers. They flinched at every noise, examined every dark shape, and rested in shifts with guards posted around their camps. James observed them from the darkness, absorbing their new behaviors, their intensifying fears, their mounting hopelessness. He had transformed into something unprecedented, not merely a fugitive slave, but a natural force, a judgment 8 years in the making. The second lesson arrived 3 days later. William Hayes was a professional slave catcher from Georgia, brought in by Davenport when the local trackers showed themselves inadequate. Hayes was unlike the farmers and fortune seekers who comprised most of the search party. He was skilled, careful, and genuinely threatening. He understood that his target was clever and had modified his methods appropriately. But Hayes had one vulnerability: pride. He couldn't accept that a mere slave could outthink a professional like himself. That pride would prove his undoing. Hayes had been following James's path for 2 days when he discovered what seemed to be a hurriedly deserted campsite. The fire was still warm. Food was scattered about as if dropped in a rush, and new footprints led away into the thick forest. It was precisely what an experienced tracker would anticipate finding when nearing desperate prey. It was also exactly what James wanted him to discover. Hayes pursued the trail deeper into the woods, his certainty growing with each distinct footprint, each snapped twig, each sign of panicked escape. He was so concentrated on the obvious path that he never noticed the nearly invisible tripwire stretched across the trail at ankle level. The trap was elegant in its straightforwardness. When Hayes's foot caught the wire, it released a carefully counterbalanced log that dropped from the trees like a massive pendulum. The strike didn't kill him right away. James had computed the weight and path to guarantee that Hayes would survive long enough to grasp what had occurred to him. As Hayes lay pinned beneath the log, his legs crushed and his rifle out of reach, James emerged from the darkness like death incarnate. But he didn't come to mock or to end his target quickly. He came to educate. "You're William Hayes?" James said, his tone composed and relaxed. "From Savannah. You've been chasing my people for 15 years. You've caught 47 runaways and returned them to their owners. You've killed 12 who tried to resist." Hayes stared up at him in disbelief. How could a slave know so much about his career? "I know because I make it my business to know," James continued as if reading his thoughts. "I know that you have a wife named Catherine and 2 daughters. I know that you live on Oglethorpe Street and that you owe money to 3 different lenders. I know that you're here because Davenport offered you $500 plus expenses to bring me back." The mental impact was devastating. Hayes had spent his career treating enslaved people as animals, incapable of complex thought or planning. The notion that one of them had investigated his personal life, had examined him as thoroughly as he examined them, destroyed his entire worldview. By the end of the second week, the essence of the chase had completely transformed. What had started as a basic hunt for a runaway slave had progressed into something far more ominous. A psychological conflict between a man who had nothing left to forfeit and a group of men who were gradually recognizing they had everything to forfeit. James had killed 3 hunters and wounded 2 others so severely they would never hunt again. But more importantly, he had demolished the confidence and spirit of the entire search party. These men had enlisted to pursue a desperate fugitive through the wilderness. They hadn't enlisted to be stalked by what seemed like a supernatural being that knew their every vulnerability and took advantage of every fear. The remaining hunters started to break into smaller factions, each distrustful of the others, each certain they were being watched from the darkness. Some wanted to give up the chase entirely, but Davenport's threats kept them in the field. Others wanted to set fire to the whole forest to drive James out. But the local authorities wouldn't permit such destruction of valuable timberland. During this period, James's methods progressed from simple endurance to sophisticated mental warfare. He began leaving personal belongings of the dead hunters in spots where their former companions would find them. A pocket watch here, a unique button there, always organized in ways that implied deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. The message was evident. James knew who they were, where they had been, and what had happened to their friends. Even more disturbing were the messages James began carving into trees throughout the forest. These weren't random threats or boasts, but detailed psychological assessments of individual hunters. He would describe their fears, their vulnerabilities, their personal backgrounds with an exactness that implied supernatural knowledge. In truth, it was simply the result of careful observation and intelligent reasoning. But to men already on the verge, it felt like sorcery. Marcus Crenshaw, Davenport's overseer, was the 4th to die, and his death was the most intimate yet. Crenshaw was the man who had lashed James countless times, who had crushed his spirit again and again, who had beaten Mary nearly to death for the crime of collapsing from exhaustion. He was also the man who knew James best, having supervised him for over a decade. If anyone could predict James's movements and strategies, it would be Crenshaw. That knowledge made him dangerous, but it also made him a target. James had been observing Crenshaw for days, absorbing his new behaviors and routines. The overseer had become paranoid and cautious, never traveling alone, always staying in the middle of his group, constantly scanning his environment. But paranoia James had learned, could be just as much a weakness as overconfidence. The trap James set for Crenshaw was his most intricate yet. It demanded patience, precise timing, and an understanding of human psychology that would have impressed a trained military strategist. First, James began leaving misleading trails and deceptive signs, designed to draw the search party toward a particular location. A narrow valley with steep walls and few escape routes. He made the signs obvious enough that Crenshaw would notice them, but subtle enough that the overseer would believe he was being clever in discovering them. Next, James initiated a campaign of mental harassment. He would show up briefly at the edge of the hunter's vision, just long enough to be seen, but not long enough to be shot at. He would leave personal items from the dead hunters in spots where Crenshaw would find them. He would create sounds at night that kept the entire group awake and tense. But perhaps most effectively, James began to exploit Crenshaw's familiarity with him. He deliberately left signs that implied he was falling back on old patterns of behavior, making the same kinds of mistakes he had made during previous escape attempts. To Crenshaw, it looked like the strain was finally affecting James, making him revert to familiar but unsuccessful tactics. The combined effect was to push Crenshaw toward desperation. The overseer became convinced that he could conclude the hunt by confronting James directly, man to man. It was precisely the mindset James had been cultivating. James also began to take advantage of the increasing tensions within the search party itself. He would leave evidence that suggested some hunters were planning to desert the search, or that others were thinking of claiming the bounty for themselves by removing their rivals. These subtle manipulations turned the hunters against each other, making them suspicious and distrustful of their own allies. The psychological pressure was so intense that several hunters began to break under the strain. They reported seeing James in places where he couldn't possibly be, hearing his voice in the wind, discovering messages that existed only in their imagination. The boundary between reality and nightmare started to dissolve, and James exploited this disorientation without mercy. The confrontation occurred on a misty morning in the narrow valley James had selected. Crenshaw, accompanied by 5 other hunters, was tracking what seemed to be a recent trail when they discovered themselves in a natural amphitheater, encircled by steep, rocky cliffs.
"I know you're here, boy,"
Crenshaw yelled into the fog. "Come out and face me like a man. You think you're so clever, but you're still just a slave. You're still my property." The reply came not from James's voice, but from the valley itself. A sequence of carefully positioned explosive charges, gunpowder stolen from the hunters' own supplies, brought down sections of the valley walls, blocking the exits and trapping the search party in a natural enclosure. As the dust settled and the echoes faded, James materialized on a ledge above them, outlined against the gray sky like an avenging spirit. "You're right about one thing, Crenshaw," James called down. "I am still the boy you used to whip. I still remember every lash, every humiliation, every moment you made me feel less than human. But you're wrong about something else. I'm not your property anymore. I'm your judgment." What followed was not a battle but an execution. James had spent days preparing the valley, converting it into a labyrinth of traps and ambush positions. He eliminated the hunters one by one, employing their own weapons against them, converting their training into their downfall. The valley had been transformed into a killing ground of remarkable sophistication. James had analyzed the acoustics to understand how sound would travel, allowing him to confuse and disorient his victims. He had prepared multiple firing positions, each with clear lines of fire and hidden escape routes. He had even rigged sections of the valley floor to collapse under weight, creating instant pit traps that could be triggered at will. But perhaps most impressively, James had prepared for every possible reaction from his victims. He had anticipated that they would try to scale the walls, and had prepared rock slides to stop them. He had expected them to try to return fire, and had positioned mirrors and reflective surfaces to confuse their aim. He had even prepared for the possibility that they might try to surrender, though he had no intention of accepting. Crenshaw was the last to die, and James made sure he understood exactly why he was dying. As the overseer lay bleeding from a dozen wounds, James knelt beside him and spoke in the same calm, conversational tone he had used with Hayes. "Do you remember Mary?" James asked. "The girl you beat for collapsing in the heat. She died 3 days after I escaped. The wounds you gave her became infected, and she died in agony." He cleared his throat softly before continuing. "Do you remember old Sarah, my grandmother? You sold her medicine to buy whiskey, and she died coughing up blood because she couldn't afford the treatment she needed." James continued reciting a litany of cruelties, each one a nail in Crenshaw's psychological coffin. By the time the overseer finally died, he understood that his death was not random violence, but justice, brutal and personal. But James wasn't finished. He took Crenshaw's whip, the same whip that had scarred his back, and used it to hang the overseer's body from a tree where the other hunters would find it. Carved into the tree trunk was a message that would be talked about in whispers for decades. "The wages of cruelty are paid in full." Word of Crenshaw's death spread through the county like wildfire. The man who had terrorized enslaved people for 20 years was dead, killed by one of his own victims in a display of tactical brilliance that military officers would study for years to come. But the psychological impact was even greater than the tactical achievement. For the first time in the history of Virginia slavery, the enslaved population had a hero, someone who had not only escaped, but had turned the tables on his oppressors in the most dramatic way possible. On plantations throughout the region, enslaved people began to whisper James's name with something approaching reverence. He had done what they had all dreamed of doing, but never dared attempt. He had made the masters afraid. And in the mountains the hunt continued. But now the hunters were the ones being hunted. As winter approached, the hunt for James had become something far beyond a simple manhunt. It had evolved into a symbol of the fundamental conflict at the heart of American society. The struggle between those who would enslave and those who would be free. Jonathan Davenport, driven by a mixture of rage, pride, and genuine fear, had increased the bounty to $2,000 and brought in professional slave catchers from as far away as New Orleans and Charleston. These weren't farmers looking for easy money or local toughs trying to impress their neighbors. These were men who made their living hunting human beings, men who understood that their prey was dangerous and acted accordingly. The new hunting party was led by a notorious slave catcher named Jeremiah Stone, a man whose reputation for brutality was legendary even in a brutal profession. Stone had been hunting runaways for 25 years and had never failed to bring back his quarry, dead or alive. He was methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless. "This isn't about the money anymore," Stone told his assembled team of 12 professional hunters. "This is about proving that no slave, no matter how clever, can defeat the natural order. If we let this boy get away with what he's done, every plantation from here to Georgia will be dealing with copycat killers within a year." Stone was right to be concerned. Word of James's exploits had spread far beyond Virginia. On plantations throughout the South, enslaved people were whispering his name and dreaming of following his example. Several attempted escapes had already been attributed to James's influence, and plantation owners were becoming increasingly paranoid about the possibility of organized resistance. The psychological impact of James's campaign was indeed spreading like wildfire through the enslaved communities of the South. Songs began to appear in the slave quarters, coded spirituals that told his story in metaphor and symbol. Children played games that reenacted his victories over the hunters. Most dangerously for the plantation system, enslaved people began to organize their own escape attempts using tactics they had learned from the stories of James's exploits. But Stone had made one crucial error in his assessment of the situation. He still thought of James as a slave, clever and dangerous perhaps, but fundamentally limited by his background and education. Stone couldn't conceive that a man born into bondage could have evolved into something that transcended the categories of master and slave entirely. James had indeed transcended those categories. Over the months of his freedom, he had become something new, not just a runaway or even a rebel, but a force of nature, a living embodiment of the rage and determination of an entire people. He had studied his enemies so thoroughly that he understood them better than they understood themselves. He had learned to think not just tactically, but strategically, not just about survival, but about victory. During the weeks before Stone's arrival, James had been busy preparing for what he knew would be the final confrontation. He had established multiple base camps throughout the mountains, each one stocked with weapons, supplies, and intelligence gathered from his previous encounters. He had mapped every trail, every stream, every cave and crevice that could provide advantage or escape. More importantly, James had begun to think beyond his own survival. He had started leaving caches of supplies and weapons in locations where other runaways might find them. He had carved detailed maps and instructions into hidden cave walls, creating a legacy that would help future fugitives, even if he didn't survive the coming battle. The final confrontation was inevitable, but James chose the time and place with the same careful calculation he had applied to everything else. The location was a box canyon deep in the mountains, a place that appeared to be a perfect trap for a desperate fugitive. The canyon had only one entrance, steep walls on three sides, and no apparent escape route. To Stone and his men, it looked like the ideal place to corner their prey. They were wrong. James had spent weeks preparing the canyon, turning it from a natural prison into an elaborate killing ground. He had studied the terrain with the eye of a military engineer, identifying every advantage and eliminating every disadvantage. He had cached weapons and supplies in hidden locations throughout the area. Most importantly, he had prepared multiple escape routes that were invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The canyon itself was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. James had identified weak points in the rock walls and had spent days carefully placing explosive charges that could bring down strategic sections on command. He had dug concealed firing positions that provided perfect fields of fire, while remaining invisible from below. He had even diverted a small stream to create a water source that would allow him to survive a prolonged siege. But perhaps most ingeniously, James had prepared the canyon to be a psychological weapon, as well as a physical one. He had arranged the bones of animals in patterns that would be visible to anyone entering the canyon, creating an atmosphere of death and foreboding. He had carved messages into the rock walls that would be illuminated by the morning sun, messages that spoke directly to the fears and guilt of his pursuers. James had also prepared a series of false escape routes designed to confuse and misdirect his enemies. These apparent exits were actually elaborate traps that would channel pursuing forces into predetermined killing zones. He had studied the psychology of military tactics and understood that professional hunters, like Stone, would expect him to have an escape plan, so he gave them several, all of them deadly. The trap was baited with James's most audacious gambit yet. He allowed Stone's men to capture another runaway, a young man named David, who had escaped from a plantation 50 miles to the south. But instead of simply rescuing David, James used him as bait, allowing Stone to think he was closing in on his primary target. The psychological warfare began immediately. James started appearing at the edges of the hunting party's vision, always just out of rifle range, always seeming to lead them toward the canyon. He left obvious trails and clear signs of his passage, making Stone believe the desperation was finally driving his quarry into making mistakes. As getting careless, Stone told his men as they followed the increasingly obvious trail. 3 months of running have finally broken his nerve. He's making the kind of mistakes that will get him killed. Stone was half right. James was indeed making mistakes, but they were calculated mistakes designed to draw the hunters into a position where their superior numbers and firepower would become disadvantages rather than advantages. The hunting party entered the canyon on a cold February morning when the mountains were locked in winter's grip, and the forest had become a crystalline maze of ice and snow. They found what appeared to be James's camp, a small fire, scattered supplies, signs of hasty abandonment. They spread out to search, confident that their quarry was finally trapped. Stone positioned his men with military precision, covering every possible escape route, establishing overlapping fields of fire, preparing for a siege if necessary. He had learned from the mistakes of the previous hunters and was taking no chances. But James had learned too, and his education had been far more thorough. The first explosion brought down a section of the canyon wall, but not randomly. James had calculated the blast to block the main entrance, while leaving his own escape routes intact. The falling rocks crushed 2 of Stone's men instantly and trapped the rest in the canyon with their prey. The second explosion triggered a carefully planned avalanche that buried 3 more hunters and filled the air with blinding snow and debris. In the chaos that followed, James moved through the remaining hunters like an avenging spirit, using weapons he had taken from previous victims, turning their own tactics against them. But this wasn't just a battle. It was a reckoning. As James fought his way through Stone's men, he spoke to each one, telling them exactly why they were dying. "You're Benjamin Crawford from Alabama," he said to one hunter as he drove a knife between the man's ribs. "You've been hunting my people for 8 years. You killed a pregnant woman in Mississippi because she tried to protect her unborn child. You're Samuel Morrison from South Carolina," he told another as he crushed the man's skull with a stolen rifle butt. "You specialize in tracking children. You've separated more families than yellow fever." Each death was personal. Each killing was justice delivered with surgical precision. James had researched these men as thoroughly as a prosecutor preparing for trial, and he was delivering verdicts that no court would ever pronounce. When the snow settled and the echoes faded, only Jeremiah Stone remained alive, and that was only because James wanted him to live, to carry the story back to those who would listen. Stone lay pinned beneath a fallen tree, his legs crushed, his rifle out of reach, staring up at the man who had destroyed his entire team. James stood over him like a figure from a nightmare, covered in blood and snow, holding weapons taken from the dead hunters. "Tell them," James said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of oppression. "Tell them that the slave they hunted no longer exists. Tell them that something else has taken his place. Something that remembers every whip, every chain, every moment of stolen dignity. Tell them that the mountains have eyes now and they're watching." James knelt beside Stone, his face inches from the broken slave catchers. Tell them that James is dead. The property they owned, the boy they whipped, the man they hunted, he's gone. But what's taken his place is something they created with their own cruelty. Tell them that every plantation, every auction block, every slave ship has been building toward this moment. Tell them that the reckoning has begun. Stone tried to speak, to threaten or bargain or plead, but James silenced him with a gesture. You don't get to talk anymore. James said quietly. For 25 years, you've been the one with the power, the one with the weapons, the one who decided who lived and who died. Now it's my turn. James stood and began walking away, leaving Stone alive but broken, trapped beneath the tree with no hope of rescue. As he reached the edge of the canyon, James turned back one final time. When they find you, if they find you, tell them this. The age of easy hunting is over. Tell them that somewhere in these mountains, there's a man who knows their names, their faces, their crimes. Tell them that the hunted has become the hunter, and the hunt will never end. Stone survived for 3 days before exposure, and his injuries finally killed him. When a rescue party found his body weeks later, they also found a message carved into the tree that had pinned him. The last lesson: there is no escape from justice, only a delay in its delivery. James was never seen again, though for decades afterward slave catchers would refuse to enter certain parts of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They spoke in whispers of a ghost in the woods, a spirit of vengeance that protected runaways and punished those who would drag them back to bondage. Some said he died in those mountains, finally free but alone. Others claimed he made it north, that he lived out his days in Canada or the Free States, his legend growing with each telling. Still others believed that he remained in the mountains, a guardian angel for other runaways, a nightmare for those who would pursue them. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more powerful than any of those versions. Perhaps James became exactly what he needed to become, not just a man who escaped slavery, but a symbol of what happens when the oppressed refuse to remain victims. When intelligence and determination transform desperation into deadly purpose. His story spread throughout the enslaved communities of the South, told in whispers around cabin fires, passed down through generations as both inspiration and warning. It reminded people that freedom had always come at a price, and that sometimes the only way to break chains was to forge them into weapons. In the years that followed, the number of successful slave escapes in Virginia increased dramatically. Plantation owners found themselves dealing with runaways who seemed to have learned new tactics, new strategies, new ways of thinking about the relationship between hunter and hunted. Some attributed this to James's direct influence, believing that he was still alive and training other fugitives. Others thought it was simply the power of his example, showing enslaved people that their oppressors were not invincible. The truth was probably both. James had proven that intelligence, preparation, and absolute determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. He had shown that the relationship between master and slave was not natural or inevitable, but artificial and fragile. Most importantly, he had demonstrated that those who profited from human misery were not immune to the consequences of their actions. The mountains still stand, and somewhere in their shadows, the legend of James continues to whisper its message, that no chain is strong enough to hold a mind determined to be free, and no hunter is safe when the hunted decides to hunt back. His story reminds us that throughout history, the human spirit has found ways to resist even the most brutal oppression, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is the refusal to accept it as inevitable. In a world where human beings were treated as property, James chose to become something that property could never be truly, terrifyingly free. And in doing so, he lit a flame that would burn in the hearts of the oppressed for generations to come. A flame that no amount of violence or intimidation could ever extinguish. The legacy of James lives on not just in the mountains where he made his stand, but in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who chooses resistance over submission, who understands that freedom is not a gift to be given, but a right to be claimed. His story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when the odds seem impossible, the human spirit can find a way to fight back, and sometimes, just sometimes, it can win. What were your thoughts on James's remarkable journey of survival and vengeance? This narrative serves as a powerful reminder that throughout history, the human spirit has consistently discovered methods to push back against even the harshest forms of oppression. The story of James demonstrates how intelligence, resolve, and an outright rejection of injustice can triumph over what appear to be insurmountable challenges. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more astounding tales that will leave you utterly amazed. And share your perspective in the comments. Was James a hero fighting for what's right, or did his actions cross a line? The answer to that question might tell us more about our own personal beliefs than we might initially think. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more fascinating historical narratives that challenge our perceptions of justice, freedom, and the true cost of defiance. This is a work of fiction. Any similarity to actual individuals, events, or locations is entirely coincidental and should not be taken as factual history. Although this narrative draws upon the historical context of slavery and resistance in 19th century America, the characters, particular incidents, and story specifics are completely invented and designed for dramatic effect. The tale aims to pay tribute to the memory of those who endured slavery and those who battled for liberty, but it ought not to be regarded as a factual record of real events.